My name is Valentino Velasquez, and today I want to talk to you about some aspects of deaf culture. Specifically talking about deaf and hard of hearing populations. There are other deaf culture aspects, of course, that are related, such as beliefs and values, attitudes, traditions, social aspects, language. There are many, many things, of course, that are related in deaf culture. But today we're specifically going to talk about deaf and hard of hearing populations. Quite a while ago, back in 1994, at Gallaudet University, in the office of the Research Institute, there was a researcher there named Judith Holt who reached out to gather information because she was curious just how many deaf and hard of hearing people we had here in the United States. She reached out and she gathered information, and she found that the National Center for Health Statistics, which is under the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, had gathered that information during a 2-year health survey that they did from 1991 to 1992. So they sent Judith the resources so she could study them. And it showed altogether how many people live here in the United States. So the population of people who have normal hearing was about 235 million people. And then the other population of people that they labeled as having hearing difficulties, which really they meant that people who were anywhere on the spectrum of hearing loss, from mild hearing loss to profound hearing loss, all of those people were grouped under the label of hearing problems. That was about 20 million people here in the United States. And that information was published in a professional journal called the American Annals of the Deaf. And then that was disseminated to the deaf community so that people could read the research. And they found, wow, that was really helpful to know how many deaf and hard of hearing people we have here in the United States. Really, they grouped that all under the label of hearing difficulties, but it was still helpful information. But they thought it would be good to have another question that focused on how many deaf and hard of hearing people live in each state. Judith didn't have that question answered in her research, so it wasn't until about 2008 the U.S. Department of Commerce, which is where the Office for the U.S. Census Bureau is. It's the responsibility of the Census Bureau to gather information on how many people live in this country. Every 10 years, they send out a survey asking things like, do you live in a house? Do you live in an apartment? And they gather information on how many people live in the United States. So another group had heard of that idea of adding that challenge question about how many deaf and hard of hearing people lived in each of the 50 states. And that group, they didn't have facts, but they were, excited to go ahead and try to get this done, and they thought that they would need a model to figure it out in order to set up a procedure of their own, a way to collect the data. So they found a model that was called the American Community Survey, and they decided to use that model because they already had branch offices set up all over at the local, state, and federal level. So easy for them to contact people and gather that information. Now remember, this was during 2008. So they gathered the data and they found out how many people lived in each of the 50 states. For instance, here in Oregon, the population who has normal hearing is about 3 million people. And then the other population, who is classified as having hearing difficulties, is about 160 million people. So they published that in the American Annals of the Deaf. 160,000 people. And they sent that to the NAD, which is the National Association for the Deaf, which is an organization that has many, many deaf and hard of hearing members. And they do things like advocacy, they help with employment and education and legal issues and things like that for the deaf community. So NAD thought it would be good to have an additional question that gathered data about how many deaf and hard of hearing people, or what they were terming people with hearing difficulties, use hearing aids or cochlear implants or small hearing aids that fit inside the ear, and also how people prefer to communicate. Did they use ASL? Did they use signed English or PSE? Or maybe cued speech? Or were they oral? So many different ways that they could communicate. I wanted to know how many of those people identified as being deaf or identified as being hard of hearing. They weren't really concerned about where people fell on the spectrum of hearing loss, whether they were mildly deaf or profoundly deaf. It was more the idea of how they identified, and they wanted to research that. The Office of the Census Bureau didn't really seem to think this was very important. They said, really, that just, having people grouped under having hearing difficulties, that's enough. But NAD said this information would be really helpful for us, so that we could have those facts in order to do research and get money from the federal level and the state level and the local level. So the Census Bureau decided to go ahead and add that question about how people prefer to communicate. What kinds of assistive hearing devices did they use, and whether they identified as deaf or hard of hearing. And we're excited about that process going forward and hope that soon we'll get the data and we'll be able to publish it. Know how many people use hearing aids or identify as deaf and hard of hearing, or how they communicate. And that information could really change people's perspective about deaf culture and the deaf and hard of hearing community. I just wanted to add one more interesting fact about something that happened in New York, in Rochester, New York. There's a university there, National Technical Institute of the Deaf, which is a school for the deaf that's under the RIT, the Rochester Institute of Technology. NTID is located there on that campus. And there was a researcher and a teacher there named Jerry Walters,